the layout, and you'll see a PowerPoint presentation. And I wanted to thank our two presenters today, Susie Pisagi and Dodie Brown, and they're from Mount Diablo Adult Education.
Oh, what's going on?
And it's okay, Susie, we can bring it back to the first slide.
Thank you.
So as we're getting the slide ready for you, I just wanted to ask Susie and Dodie to introduce themselves and give us some background about Learning to Achieve, as well as their instructional practices at Mount Diablo.
Good afternoon. This is Susie Pisagi. Can you hear me okay? I'm going to assume yes, unless I see otherwise.
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. I am the Assistant Director at Mount Diablo Adult Education. I participated in the Learning to Achieve training last summer and loved the material, felt there was some excellent information. And I took this training back to my school site, and Dodie Brown, one of our instructors, she's our director of our surgical tech program here, she has implemented many of these strategies, and so she's also going to be sharing how she's implemented these strategies today. If you do have any questions as we go, please feel free to type in those questions and we will answer them as we can. If we don't answer them right away, we will make sure to answer them at the end of the session. And please, this is our first time presenting on a webinar, so it's a little different not to see your shining faces in front of us and to see people nodding and clearly with us or nodding off. So please let us know if we're going too fast or too slow, and we will learn along with you. So to get started, this Learning to Achieve was a program that was developed by the National Institute for Literacy. Many of you know this is NIFL. That organization has changed hands. It is now the U.S. Department of Education's Literacy Information and Communication Systems. It replaces the Bridges to Practice program that some of you may be familiar with, and this was a training for educators serving adults with learning disabilities as well. It's based on very recent rigorous research on learning disabilities, and many of the strategies are aligned with the STAR reading program, for those of you who are familiar with that. Our objectives today is that at the end of this session, you will be able to identify the research-based tools and techniques that are used to effectively teach adults with specific learning disabilities, and to identify and implement those strategies and approaches that really help all adults learn, particularly those with learning disabilities. So what I want to emphasize today is most of us in adult education don't necessarily know when our students have a learning disability. And many of our students are not comfortable self-disclosing that information. They are tired of the label. They want to be seen as, quote, normal, unquote, and it's often hard to know who is struggling in our classes because of a learning disability. So what I want to emphasize is that all of these strategies we're going to talk about today are effective for all students. So I think it's important to think of it that way. And if you have students with learning disabilities, then they're going to be able to access the material and information so much easier because of these strategies. So we're going to talk briefly about the definition of learning disabilities and the laws that affect adults with learning disabilities, and then we will dive right into the strategies. And just so you know, what we did is we pulled some of the slides and information from various chapters of Learning to Achieve. There's I think maybe 20 chapters in this program, and we tried to just pull together the key points that you would need to know and then really focus on the instructional strategies. So you may see slide numbers at the bottom of the slides that don't always go in order, and there's a reason for that. So starting out with the definition of learning disabilities, the U.S. Department of Education put together a group of practitioners and parents and researchers from across the United States to really finally put a definition together about specific learning disabilities that everybody would agree with. And from that, they developed 6 consensus statements which really define adults with learning disabilities. So just so that we're all on the same page, many of you may already know this, but we'll go over this briefly. First of all, specific learning disabilities and that concept is valid and supported by strong converging evidence. There have been people that have said, oh, there's no such thing, the student's being lazy, various other assorted things. And it is truly supported by strong evidence that there is such a thing as specific learning disabilities and that it is actually neurologically based. It's something that's going on in the brain that makes it difficult for someone to learn in maybe more of a traditional way. And it's very intrinsic to the individual. It's different in each individual. So one person's learning disability may look completely different than somebody else's learning disability. The other thing that's important to know is that it persists across the lifespan. So a student may say, well, I used to have a learning disability, but in fact, if they ever had one, they still have it. They just maybe have learned how to manage it and how to accommodate for their challenges. Or what most often happens is that they learn really well how to hide it, and that makes it hard for us as teachers. It may occur in combination with other disabling conditions, but it's not due to mental retardation or some behavior disturbance or being in an environment where they had a lack of opportunity to learn or any kind of sensory deficit, blindness, deafness. It's not due to those conditions. It may be in combination with, but not due to. And it's evident across all ethnic, cultural, language, and economic groups. These are the different patterns of strength or weakness that you may notice in individuals with learning disabilities. And again, it's different with each person. So one person may have great challenge in attention, but do excellent at spelling, or they may have much difficulty with auditory processing what they hear, but maybe their writing they have no problem with. So it really varies for each individual, and that's why sometimes it's really hard to diagnose. What you see on your screen now are the 3 laws that federal laws that affect adults with learning disabilities. And this diagram, there's a whole chapter on this, so we won't go into this in great detail, but I wanted you to just be aware of the key points of the 3 federal laws. So number 1, the IDEAA that you see on the left side is most applicable, or it is only applicable to people up to age 21. It establishes all the laws for the IEPs, the individual education plans, free and appropriate education, least restrictive environment, probably terms you've heard that are mostly connected with K-12 education. The Rehabilitation Act, the circle on the right, is really a civil rights act. It prohibits any kind of discrimination of people with disabilities. The law provides equal access, and you may have heard of Section 504, which is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And this is something that you should be aware of, providing services to adults. Adults, if they request a 504 plan, we must provide that. And essentially, it is a plan laying out accommodations for our students. Number 4 is the ADAAA, and you may wonder about this. Most people know this is the ADA. It's the Adults with Disabilities Act, and it is, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the 2 extra A's are the 2 amendments that have been made over the years since the original act was put into place. And this is also a civil rights law. It extends the 504 plan to adults. It prohibits discrimination in all aspects, so physical plus programming. And it applies to people of all ages. So the two most important ones for us to be aware of is the Rehabilitation Act and the ADAAA, which are the ones that apply to our adults. I think the most important piece to remember out of these two laws is that we need to always remember to level the playing field for adults with disabilities. We don't need to require less of them, so like a career tech ed class, it doesn't mean that we can require that less skills. They need to still perform, but we need to provide the accommodations so that they have the same access and equal opportunity to learning as anybody else in your class. So that's, I think, the most important thing to remember. I went through those fairly quickly. Are we doing okay? Let me know by your status if we need to slow down. And are there any questions at this point? Okay. I am going to now hand the microphone over. We're using one, so I'm going to hand over the ear set. You may hear some static over to Dodie, who's going to start talking about the instructional strategies.
Okay. Hello, everybody. So far I've been managing the chat pod, but I'm going to pass that off to Susie. What we're going to do now is we're actually going to delve into the instructional strategies. If I need to talk louder or anything like that, please make sure you guys let me know. Hopefully it should be good. Learning to Achieve includes many strategies for teaching reading, written expression, and for English language learners. But this presentation will focus on content learning that applies to all adult education classes. So we're going to be very specific in what we cover today. Obviously we don't have enough time in 1 hour to go over everything. Susie actually, I think, spent about 5 days going through this whole program. So feel free to check out Learning to Achieve and see some of those other strategies that they have available. They're really great. So what is content learning? You know, we want to make sure we define everything. So content learning is the acquisition of information from written material. It's about the student truly understanding and making sense of the material that we give to them and that they get. So examples of content learning include reading and learning content on a variety of topics related to the field, the degree of the credential that students are studying in your classes. So for example, all topics in my course are focused on surgical technology, and so the students must learn anatomy, physiology, and other concepts as they relate to various surgical procedures, and then the tasks surrounding them. So it's very specific content learning. Some other things are the foundational concepts of our government that are required by the citizenship tests, and then usually across the board for everyone, all that information that is contained in manuals that employees are expected to read and understand. So there are lots of examples of content learning, and in fact, for most people, reading for content learning is an everyday occurrence. So it's not something that we encounter once in a while. It's really an everyday thing that we all do. So we just defined, and I kind of spoke very briefly, hopefully not too quickly, about what content learning is, but what are the content learning challenges that adults with learning disabilities may face? So some of these things, content learning depends really on how well an individual can negotiate the characteristics of a text. So examples are, such as tiny writing, or maybe even just the organization of the text on each page. Maybe there's too much text, maybe there's too little, maybe they need the words set up in a certain way for them to truly really to get it. And some adults without learning disabilities are capable of learning content from difficult and complicated material. Really only some. When doing taxes, for instance, they can use an IRS instruction manual. I know for me I can't. But most people really would have difficulty learning this content from an IRS manual. However, they might learn from a tax manual that explains it in simpler terms, with lots of examples and explanations. So some can get it and others will kind of fade out or be overwhelmed. Now for adults with learning disabilities, they may have difficulty learning content from textual material that actually most people would find understandable. So when you're looking at something just because it seems understandable to you doesn't mean that it is going to be easy for all of your students. Material that's accessible for the average adult learner may not be for many adults with learning disabilities. And what feels simple to one may not feel the same to another. So let's consider some different factors that can make comprehension difficult. So please make sure if I'm going a little too fast, everybody lets me know, puts a hand up and things like that. So this slide is pretty much a schematic that really shows all of the different factors that are involved in content learning. So on the right, for instance, you can see that we must accomplish many things during higher order processes, which include interpreting, comparing, and contrasting, and also knowing the difference between what is fact and then what's opinion. One's working memory, their listening and reading comprehension can really influence this understanding and all of these different processes. These are a person's individual characteristics, and they work kind of like a filing cabinet, so depending on how well organized it is, how much access we have, will determine our level of understanding. So the list on the left, if you look at it, it has 1 through 5 there, amount of information. These are the different characteristics of the text. So we can use different instructional strategies, which we're going to go over here in a little bit, to help reorganize this information and make it accessible for the student. So for instance, if you have a textbook and it has a lot of information, so the amount of information is massive, it might be difficult for some students to be able to really access it. They might actually kind of zone out, or they just might get really overwhelmed because it's just too much for them to manage. So when an individual's content learning abilities are well matched with the text that they're reading, then content learning can occur. And when the reading material makes demands that exceed the learner's skills, then content learning is unlikely to occur. So what this means is that instructors can make learning easier by teaching learners how to take an organized, mindful approach to content learning. So hopefully, using these strategies, you don't necessarily have to try to teach them everything, because there is a lot of information in our classes, but you're actually giving them the tools to take ownership over their own learning and their own instruction. And this way, even when they say move on to another class and they don't have you, as amazing as you are as an instructor, they'll still be able to learn. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting a little dry throat here. So now let's consider these ways to make content learning more accessible for our students. So there's a strong body of research, and we keep saying this, to guide us on how to address the content learning needs of adults with learning disabilities. We're going to mainly look at 3 different strategies, but again, Learning to Achieve offers many other strategies that we don't have the time to cover in this webinar. So what we are going to go over are looking at explicit instruction, so the I do, we do, you do feedback method. Reading comprehension, utilizing summarizing specifically, and then the use of graphic organizers. You can use one at a time, or you can actually use all of these strategies and various combinations to help with content learning. So I'm going to pass the mic again, and Susie's going to discuss utilizing explicit instruction.
Okay, explicit instruction is essentially, oops, I forgot, I'm forwarding slides again, is essentially a scaffolded process. And with scaffolded, we mean that you start with a lot of support, and then you slowly take away that support until someone is doing something independently. So explicit instruction is a scaffolded process with clear, specific, and comprehensive instruction. So let's start with providing clear explanation. Oh, it should, yes, explanation, sorry. I always try to think of the 4 C's when I think clear explanations: comprehensive, clear, concise, and making sure to check for understanding. So I always think task analysis when I'm thinking about how clear my instructions are. And an example I always remember is if you were teaching somebody who had never cooked before and didn't know anything about cooking how to make a peanut butter sandwich, and you said, okay, now put the jam on the bread. And they might take the entire jar of jam and plop it on top of the bread. Because you didn't say, open the jar, put the knife in, all the things that you think, well, of course they would know that. So when you're thinking as you're teaching, of course they would know that, back up and maybe explain that instead. The second step in explicit instruction is the modeling, the I do. And this is really the critical piece. I think all these, if you look at all these steps, you think, oh, of course, that's natural for an instructor. But I think what's important to think about is that we forget sometimes to do each one of these steps when we're instructing. And so the more you can use all of these steps when you're instructing, the clearer your instruction's going to be and the more your students are going to learn. The I do is a critical piece. We know that many of our students learn best by seeing others doing it. I know as an administrator, I sometimes forget. I ask someone to do something and I forget to give them an example. And when I give an example, I know I'm going to get back what I was asking for. When I forget to give an example, it might be interpreted differently. So I think you have to think of that also when you're doing modeling. If they can see you do it, it makes more sense. And the other critical piece on the I do is to do what we call a think aloud. These are when you're instructing about memorizing something, you can give them I can never say this word, mnemonics, or other ways to remember something, little helpful hints, ways that you figured out how to memorize something, or just how to do something. So for example, our sterile processing class, the teacher, there's certain reasons why you pick up certain instruments and other times where you pick up other instruments. And so instead of just telling them, this is when you take this instrument and this is when you take this instrument, she can explain to them why she knew which instrument to choose and what her thinking process was aloud on why she chose that. And Dodie will give you some more examples of that later as well. So I want you to take a moment to think about something that you've taught recently that you might not have modeled, and think about how, and especially a think aloud. What is something that you teach that you could do the think aloud? You could talk them through your thought process to figure out how you got to that answer. So just take a few minutes to do that. And when you've done that, why don't you give me a check mark in your My Status Active section. This would normally be when we do a think, pair, share, but we can't do that on a webinar. Okay, great. I'm going to keep moving. We all have different timing on these things. The third step in explicit instruction is engaging in that scaffolded practice of we do. The we do and then the you do. So again, this is something you would do with your students together. And the important piece for this is to guide or give feedback as they're doing the we do and the you do, and to check for understanding of skills at every step. So the best way to do this, of course, is first to do a we do. We do it all together. Okay, class, let's all do it together. Let's figure out this chart together. And then you do, okay, now you're going to do this on your own. It takes a lot of the fear and stress away for students. And then last is, of course, once they've done it by themselves, to provide elaborate feedback that is immediate, positive, and corrective. We all know that if we forget to give our students their test results back until a week later, it's not nearly as effective as if we can do it the next day. And when they're practicing a skill, do make sure to give them very, very specific feedback. I think I have a question here. Nope. Oh, did that go away? Okay. Did somebody have a question for the chat box? Yes, I see Y. Brooks has raised her hand. Do you have a question? You can put that in the chat box. Okay. Okay. Go ahead and ask your question if you can in the chat box. I'll keep going and then we'll go back to the question. Okay. The second strategy that we want to talk about is content instruction, and really it's about reading comprehension. It's understanding what you read. And we just don't want to assume that students are good at this. You know, sometimes we think by the time they're adults and they've been through school, they know how to look at text and comprehend it. But that's definitely not necessarily the case. So this is something, again, that you can do together as a class and model these strategies that we're going to talk about. This is really about actively engaging with the text. So if you look at the list, first of all, of course, being active and intentional in what you read. And being active and intentional can be highlighting. I know that when I was in school and when I'm reading a textbook, it helps me to highlight the most important key points. It gives me something to do, and it helps me be intentional about what I think is important. So even doing that as a group together, to have the students open their textbooks and, okay, let's read the first section, and or maybe even you do it and show an example. I'm going to read this first section, and as you read, you say, oh, I think that was a really key point. I'm going to highlight it. So again, it's that very explicit instruction. Connecting it with background knowledge. What do you already know about this information in this text today? How can we bring back what we do know, and now we're going to be adding to that information by what we read? And then using the following strategies. And again, if you can do this with the class together, especially in the beginning of your class, people will then start being able to do this on their own. So previewing really is having everybody go through the text and looking at where are the titles? Let's look at the titles and the headings in the different sections. What are the questions at the end? So looking at this, now we can predict, what do we think this whole section in this book is about? What do you think it's going to be talking about? What do you think we're going to be learning? And having those conversations with your entire class before they tackle reading that text. Then, of course, going over the unfamiliar words. We could go through and just skim and highlight words that we don't know, and then let's talk about them and let's go over the meaning of those words. Or you, as a teacher, may have a sense of what those unfamiliar words are going to be and go over that vocabulary before they even start reading the text, and then going over it again later. And summarizing is something that we're going to talk about in a minute in greater detail, and paraphrasing. And then, of course, representing the information that they read graphically. And Dodi's going to talk a lot about graphic organizers and how we can represent the information we read graphically. Is there a question I need to answer, or Dodi, you're doing it? Great. Okay, great. So summarizing, I think we all know what summarizing is, and we've all done it when we've had to for various courses, but there's some very specific strategies you can do and you can teach your students that will help them summarize. And this isn't that easy. When we were in our workshop, we all worked on a particular reading and worked on this strategy, and it took some practicing. So again, this would be important to do as an I do, we do, you do strategy. Do it all together as a class first, or you do it first and demonstrate. So with summarizing, the first thing you can do is to delete any unnecessary material. So it's sort of the opposite of highlighting. Instead of highlighting the key points, which you could have also done, you're now crossing out what's maybe just examples, superfluous extra information that you don't need to use to summarize. And then delete the repetitive material. Now, usually in written material it's repeated several times, maybe in different ways, but it's still repetitive. Then compose a word to replace a list of items. So, for example, if there's an article about sports and they're listing all the equipment that you need, the basketball shoes, the ball, the ankle brace, you're going to cross all those words out and put next to it basketball equipment. You would do that also with verbs. So you would look at action words that all represent one primary action and cross those out and replace it with one individual action verb. Then you would select a topic sentence, if there is one. Oftentimes, and ideally, it's the first sentence of the paragraph or the first sentence of this section of reading that you're doing, but not always. It may be somewhere later, or it may be that there isn't one that's really a good overall topic sentence, and you have to invent a topic sentence. So with all that information, then you can put all that together and summarize what you just read in your own words. And these sets of strategies make it so much easier. Now, Dodie is going to talk to you about our third strategy, graphic organizers.
Okay. Yes. So Susie just talked about some different strategies, and before I go on to graphic organizers, I was just going to share a couple things that I do, or that I actually implemented after learning some of these practices and these different strategies. So the first thing that I do is during the first week of class, my program is actually an entire year. It's a year-long program. So the very first week of class, I actually hand out a handout that shows different reading strategies, listening strategies, note-taking, things like that for lectures. And we actually go through that with them. And then I talk about the previewing, how to look at the title headings, the bolded words, looking for unfamiliar words. Because with surgical technology, most of the students coming in don't necessarily have a medical background. So seeing the word appendectomy all of a sudden isn't necessarily going to make sense day one. Or for instance, today, talking to a student, talking about a surgery and mitral valve replacement. Well, until we talked about the heart and the different structures of the heart, mitral valve doesn't really make sense out of that context. So just explaining to them about having a dictionary available and looking up unfamiliar words until they become part of their vocabulary. So that's one thing. Another thing that I do is I actually give them, I named it a student reader, just from what I used to get in college, and it literally is an outline of the term and all of the stuff that we're going to go over, but it's just an outline. So what I do is I make them, when they read each chapter, they have a section on that chapter in their outline, and they have to fill out the information. So it actually gives them some of those summarizing, paraphrasing skills that they can actually use. So that's kind of a couple of things that I do. Now here's from Learning to Achieve some different graphic organizers. And there's a strong research base that supports the use of graphic organizers as an effective content learning tool for individuals. Really all individuals, I use them a lot. For individuals with learning disabilities, I can't talk today, and it can be helpful to all students. It's great to use these in conjunction with explicit instruction, and are perfect if you have a document reader. And I actually do it a lot with explicit instruction. It's great to use together. We're going to show you some different examples, but know that there are many, many more available. At the end of this slideshow, there's going to be a list of websites that you have available that you can actually find different graphic organizers. And they really are only limited by your own imagination. So let's explore why graphic organizers can be effective for content learning. So there are three main reasons why graphic organizers can be effective learning tools for all students, and especially for those with learning disabilities. But I am sure that after we go through this, and if you've used them previously in your class, which I'm sure you have, you can find many more reasons. So number one is graphic organizers can increase content knowledge because important information is presented clearly and precisely. So breaking down maybe that huge page of information into smaller components. The second thing is that they combine showing with telling. They decrease the literacy demands while kind of structuring that higher order thinking that we were talking about, so those critical thinking pieces. And I'm going to explain a little bit more on one of the slides later. Also, graphic organizers can be used flexibly. They really can be used for almost anything, and I use them a lot in my class, so much so that eventually students actually start using them themselves, which is really great. And they come up with ways that amaze me that I didn't even think about using them for. They're visual in a way that helps many people, and they can be used before, during, and after demonstrations or reading. So we're going to go through some examples. So while I'm kind of going through them, definitely think about which ones might be good for your classes, and be sure to kind of jot down maybe ideas that pop in your head about ways you can use these. So this one is great. I know someone had said, especially for ESL, vocabulary is a big thing. They're learning a lot of new vocabulary. So this is a great example of what's called a word wall. You can take any vocabulary and put it into this kind of graphic organizer. It not only defines the words, but it provides visual cue and additional connections for the student to help remember. So what I usually do with something like this is we go over the word, I have them define it in their own words, and then I literally make them draw their own pictures, which can be kind of crazy if the concept doesn't immediately bring a picture to your mind, but it's a great learning tool to actually have them come up with a picture, especially if it's off the wall. Truthfully, they end up remembering that word more, and it almost becomes an automatic recognition for them. And then also having them create some different connections, maybe with prior knowledge, or if it's as far as learning new languages, maybe creating connections in their own language that help them remember this new word. So this one's really great. This one we provided a kind of a blank format. It's considered a main idea and details template. This can be used to break down a chapter, a paragraph, or even used to organize specific subjects. It's really great for comparing and contrasting. So for example, in this one, our main idea can be muscle tissue. And then we can say muscle tissue is about, do I have my little arrow guy? So muscle tissue is about a major component of the body that provides movement. And then what we can do is in this first little weird looking shaped box, we can put skeletal muscle, this one could be smooth, and then this one could be cardiac. And then down here in these boxes, you actually would put some details of different things. And then finally, this last one, a lot of times you can do like what's important about it or elaborate on something more expansive in this last box. So that's muscle tissue. Now in my class, I actually use this comparison chart. We go really into detail about specifics about muscle. So not just where they are, their location, but also the different, how many mitochondria are there, the sarcomeres, which is a smaller part of the muscle fiber, and they have to know all of that stuff. So I use this, and this breaks down the complexities of different muscle tissues. And I actually utilize this chart in combination with explicit instruction in my own class. So what happens is I will fill in a few of the boxes in lecture using a document reader, and then I pair them up, and they have to actually complete the chart together. We review and go over the correct answers, so that's that kind of feedback, making sure everybody has the correct answers in there. And this is one of the first chapters that we encounter in anatomy and physiology. And as we progress through the year, I provide charts, but with less and less information on them so that they begin to use them on their own. It's very easy to put information into an Excel spreadsheet. That's actually what I used for this one, and the following slide I'm going to show you in a second. And I also have many blank charts available in our class library, and frequently remind students that if the charts help them, they may use the blank ones with any information we cover throughout the year. And as I think I said earlier, they actually surprised me with some of the charts they come up with and what they use them for. So here's just another example. We use this one for digestive system, and this is actually homework I give them, so now this is the you do part. So they individually have to do this chart at home. So it's all of the different organs in the digestive system, and then they have to figure out, you know, what category is it, where is it at, functions, and all of these different things. Kind of check it off. Okay. And we cover this chapter many, many weeks after muscles, so they're getting used to the charts. Now this one is an attributes chart, and it could be used to present a concept with kind of key defining attributes of something. So, such as like characteristics of mammals, so you could put mammals in the middle and then represent different characteristics, or requirements maybe for an individual must meet to run for president, their age, all these different things, U.S. citizen, stuff like that. And then, so what I want you to do is looking at this one chart here, okay, it's blank. Just think for a moment how you might use this in your class, and when you come up with something, jot it down, and then can you give us a little green check or agree? It'd be fun if they had thumbs up and thumbs downs too. So go ahead and do that. I'll give you a minute. Okay, so we're kind of getting down. Oh, we're doing pretty good. But we have 10 minutes left, so go ahead. If you haven't thought of that, just definitely when you think of it, I think about half of you guys have come up with something, so I'm going to move on. I have a couple more. Graphic organizers. So this one is a great example for any kind of sequencing. It doesn't necessarily have to be specific time sequence, but some topics that are appropriate for this one are events that led to the stock market crash in 1929. We all know about that one. A history timeline, stages of development. So I use it maybe also in learning about fetal development, so how the baby progresses. And then also what to expect sequentially in a job interview. I'm actually going to be using this one in a few weeks when we go over interviewing skills and actually writing down the different steps and things that they can expect, so they're not surprised when they go into an interview. They're as prepared as they can be and hopefully get the job, because that's why really we have our adults come through. We're trying to give them those different job skills. Okay. This one is considered a concept map, so you take a specific concept that you have and then you literally just branch down. This one includes pictures, which I find are really great. A lot of learners are visual learners, and it really doesn't hurt to provide a visual with their information. So this one is the branches of the government, so if any of you teach that, this is a great one for you. And the last one that I'm going to talk about is, as you can see, a little more complicated than some of the others that we have filled out. But what's great is it breaks this down. And this one is a cause and effect graphic organizer. The main concept is smoking, which is distinguished by being in the center. It's also a darker color, and it's all in capital letters. So you can use text and coloring and things like that to actually even expand your graphic organizers even more. The next level around with the circles are the levels that show the negative effects of smoking, and 8 are listed here. And for each negative effect, there's 2 examples that are listed. So as you can see, there's 3 different levels of information. The first level is the main concept, or the cause, in this case smoking. The second level are negative effects of smoking. And then the third one are very specific examples. It's a great example of how graphic organizers can help learners elaborate on a single concept. But what's cool is you can use this graphic organizer prior to their reading, so discussing what learners already know and filling in the circles prior to their knowledge. So most of your students coming in, you ask them, what does smoking do? They're going to know a few things, right? And be able to kind of come up with some of their own. You could also just use it during reading. So they're actually taking notes on causes as they're reading. You give them, it has smoking in the center, and they have to fill out the rest as you're lecturing. Helps them actually do more focused attention practice, which a lot of people aren't as good at doing. And then after reading, you could pull from the learner's knowledge during class to develop specific examples for some or all of the causes. Also, you can ask learners to use the information on the graphic organizer that they just created and engage them in that higher order thinking. So that critical thinking that is really hard as an instructor to learn, because you can't just tell them to think critically. You have to kind of give them the skills and the tools to do it. So what you could do is kind of go beyond this by asking them, for example, which effects are more serious? So if I ask one student versus another, truthfully, they might say cancer versus personal appearance. It just depends on their own personal, right, feelings for what they're going to do. But also, you could expand and ask them to identify which are easier to detect. They could use information plan anti-smoking. So you really can keep this going. So I've just shown you some examples, but again, there are many, many more, and you really can create your own. So we've explored why graphic organizers can be effective. Now let's connect it to kind of that principle of explicit instruction. Okay, I'm trying to move. We only got 9 minutes left. So main point, graphic organizers have a great potential for facilitating content learning. However, how they are used for planning and teaching are very important considerations for their effectiveness. You can't just throw them at them. So using explicit instruction helps. So again, just reiterating, provide those clear explanations, those 4 C's that Susie was talking about. Modeling it. You do it. Actually fill out the graphic organizer all the way partially and show them how to do it. Put them into groups, pairs, and have them practice it in groups. Takes off the pressure. And then later on, have them do it individually so that they start developing those skills by themselves. And really, really, really important, provide that feedback as immediate and as positive as you could possibly give it as soon as they're done. Okay, so that's it for my part. And Susie's going to do a quick wrap-up, and we'll have a couple seconds for some questions.
Hello again. So to wrap up what we've gone over today, we've talked a little bit about what learning to achieve actually is. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how we define learning disabilities. We've gone over the 3 most critical federal laws that govern services to adults with learning disabilities. We've talked about what content learning is and what the learning challenges are for adults with learning disabilities in content learning. And we've talked about 3 instructional principles that support content learning. So first was the explicit instruction, the I do, we do, you do, and clear feedback. Second is the reading comprehension strategies, which includes previewing, predicting, vocabulary, summarizing, and paraphrasing. And third were the graphic organizers. These are some great resources that I found actually on the internet to find graphic organizers that are blank that you can print out, and they come in all shapes, sizes, types, and they'll tell you how you can use different ones. They're often categorized. So these are great resources, and I have to tell you that how I found these was simply by typing in graphic organizers into the Google search bar. And all these websites came up. And I think these were actually the first 4. There had been a few I skipped that were more K-12-ish than adult-oriented. But so you can find these probably more quickly and easily by just typing in graphic organizers in Google search. But you will get a copy of these slides, so you'll have this information for future reference. These are the sources that Learning to Achieve included at the back of their content learning section. So these are this is books or articles that you can access to get more information. You'll see a website in the midst of this, graphicorganizers.com. That is no longer on the web. You know how those things change. So that's what caused me to, luckily I checked, and that caused me to go online and search for more websites. So that's one thing that's not useful, but the rest of this information you should be able to access if you want more information. And Amy, I think, will tell you how you'll be getting these slides if you would like to get copies of them. Before we finish up, are there any questions? So Teresita said that we can have access to some of these with fees. There are some that you have to get, some of these graphic organizer sites that you have to pay a fee, but a lot of them were free downloads. So you just go on them, click on the one you like, you can download it, print it out, make copies, and use for your classroom. And I do want to emphasize that you can draw your own graphic organizer. It doesn't have to be perfect. And you know, you've seen people do it when they're trying to come up with a paper and they draw little clouds and lines, and you know, it doesn't have to be a perfectly printed document. You can also have your students draw their own graphic organizers. And also, as Dodie mentioned, you can just make one in Excel really easily. Make a chart in Excel or make a chart on Word. Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, I think right now I'll turn it over to Amy.
Thank you so much, Susie. And as you're thinking of questions for Susie and Dodie, I wanted to show you how you can download their presentation file. So in front of you, your screen should be changing to a new layout, and in the bottom middle section of your screen, you'll see how to download the PowerPoint. So this is a PDF file that we created from the PowerPoint presentation that you saw today. And what you can do is you can click on the file in the pod below and then click on Save to My Computer. There's a button on the very bottom, and a new window will open up in your Explorer or your internet browser. And then click on Download, and it'll show you where on your computer you can download the file. So as you're doing that, you can definitely use the chat pod to ask any additional questions that you may have. And I also wanted to go over some announcements with you. If you look at the very top, there is a online questionnaire that we'd like you to take. It's the web surveyor link that you see in the very top part of the announcements box. If you click on that, you can take the online questionnaire and give us your feedback. And you can also request certificates of attendance by emailing me at apark@air.org. And you can see that Barbara has also put in the chat pod that if you wanted the PDF file directly emailed to you, you can email calpro@air.org. And also, Susie and Dodie mentioned Learning to Achieve several times, and if you look at the box that says online resources in the middle of your screen, there's some online publications from links.edu.gov. If you go to that website, you'll see some wonderful resources. You can see that there's some educators' guides on learning disabilities that they geared towards adult educators. And also wanted to let you know that this webinar has been recorded and will be archived onto the CalPro Instructors Forum website, which is listed up there at the top under online resources. So if you have any questions, please type it into the chat pod. And as you're doing that, I also wanted to ask everyone to give a great round of applause to Susie and Dodie for their presentation. It was wonderful to see all those graphic organizers, as well as going through the steps of explicit instruction. I loved your example of the peanut butter sandwich. It was good visual for me. I thought about that a lot as you were talking about the steps, and just talking about summarizing and the different comprehension strategies that students can use to be very effective in learning. So if no one has any more questions, feel free to exit out of the meeting by just Xing out of your internet browser. Others, I can leave this room open a little bit longer. If you have any other questions, you can type into the chat pod. And CalPro is here and available for other webinars, online courses, and face-to-face regional workshops. And you can visit our website at calpro-online.org for additional information. So Susie and Dodie, thank you so much for preparing a wonderful presentation and giving such great examples. We appreciate everything you did to prepare, and I just wanted to thank you on behalf of CalPro and the state of California, and among all the attendees here today. Thank you so much for your presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.